Most people assume that narcissists are emotionally invincible. They often appear confident, fearless, and completely unaffected by criticism or rejection. From the outside, they can seem as though nothing gets under their skin, but beneath that carefully constructed image is a very different emotional reality. What many people don't realize is that narcissistic behavior is often built around protecting an extremely fragile sense of self. The confidence you see is usually not genuine self-esteem. It is a defense mechanism designed to keep painful feelings hidden. This doesn't mean that narcissists experience emotions in the same way emotionally healthy people do. Instead, their emotional world is often dominated by shame, insecurity, fear of inadequacy, and an overwhelming need to avoid anything that threatens the image they have created for themselves. One of the biggest misconceptions is that narcissists never suffer emotionally. In reality, they can experience intense emotional distress, but the triggers are very different from what affects most people. Rather than feeling deeply hurt by the loss of intimacy or genuine connection, they are more likely to break down when their carefully managed identity begins to crack. Their emotional stability depends heavily on external validation, admiration, and control. When those things disappear, they may experience what psychologists sometimes describe as a narcissistic injury, a deep emotional wound caused by perceived failure, rejection, or humiliation. Imagine spending your entire life trying to convince yourself and everyone around you that you are exceptional, superior, or beyond criticism. Every compliment becomes proof that your identity is secure, while every criticism feels like evidence that your worst fears might actually be true. That is an exhausting way to live. Because their self-worth depends so heavily on outside approval, narcissists often become trapped in an endless cycle of seeking admiration while avoiding vulnerability. They may appear powerful, but internally, they are constantly working to maintain a version of themselves that can never afford to be imperfect. This explains why even small events can provoke surprisingly intense reactions. A simple disagreement, constructive feedback at work, or someone setting a healthy boundary can trigger anger, defensiveness, or emotional collapse. To an outside observer, the response may seem exaggerated. But for the narcissist, the event is not just about the disagreement itself. It represents a threat to the identity they have worked so hard to protect. Instead of processing those feelings in a healthy way, they often redirect the discomfort outward by blaming others, denying responsibility, or becoming emotionally explosive. Another important point is that narcissists usually struggle with self-reflection. Looking inward requires acknowledging flaws, mistakes, and emotional pain. For someone whose identity depends on appearing perfect or superior, that process can feel unbearable. As a result, they often avoid honest self-examination and instead focus on changing the people around them. If relationships fail, someone else must be at fault. If opportunities disappear, others must be jealous or unfair. This pattern protects them from immediate emotional pain, but it also prevents genuine personal growth. Ironically, the very strategies narcissists use to protect themselves often create the emotional instability they are trying to avoid. Constantly needing admiration means they are never fully secure. Constantly seeking control means they become anxious whenever life becomes unpredictable. Constantly avoiding vulnerability means they never experience the kind of authentic relationships that create lasting emotional resilience. Over time, this can leave them feeling isolated, frustrated, and emotionally exhausted, even if they continue projecting confidence to the outside world. Understanding this hidden emotional landscape is not about feeling sorry for narcissistic behavior or excusing manipulation. Harmful actions still have real consequences, and healthy boundaries remain essential. Instead, recognizing what lies beneath the surface helps explain why narcissists react so intensely to situations that may seem minor to everyone else. Their emotional world is built on maintaining an image rather than developing a secure sense of self. When that image begins to crack, the emotions they have spent years avoiding can suddenly rush to the surface, revealing just how fragile the foundation really is. One of the most emotionally destabilizing experiences for a narcissist is losing control over someone they once believed they could influence. Control is often at the center of how they maintain relationships. It gives them a sense of security, importance, and superiority. Whether that control comes through charm, manipulation, guilt, intimidation, or constant attention, it reinforces the belief that they can shape the behavior of others to meet their own emotional needs. When that control begins to slip away, it creates a level of emotional discomfort that can be surprisingly intense. This often happens when someone starts recognizing unhealthy patterns and decides to change the way they respond. Instead of arguing, they remain calm. Instead of explaining themselves repeatedly, they set clear boundaries. Instead of chasing after approval, they focus on their own well-being. These changes may seem simple from the outside, but for a narcissist, they represent something much larger. They signal that the usual methods of influence are no longer working. At first, the narcissist may not believe the change is real. They might assume the other person will eventually return to old habits. They may test the situation by sending unexpected messages, making emotional appeals, offering compliments, or creating situations designed to provoke a reaction. If those strategies fail, frustration begins to build. They may become increasingly confused because the predictable dynamic they relied upon has disappeared. As the loss of control becomes more obvious, their behavior often becomes more extreme. Some narcissists become angry and confrontational, accusing the other person of being selfish, cold, or disrespectful. Others shift into a more subtle approach, acting unusually kind, apologetic, or affectionate in an attempt to pull the person back into the relationship. These dramatic changes are not always signs of genuine personal growth. More often, they reflect an urgent attempt to restore the balance of power they feel they are losing. The emotional breakdown comes from the realization that someone they once considered emotionally dependent has become independent. For a narcissist, this independence can feel like rejection. Even when the other person is simply making healthy choices, they may interpret boundaries as personal attacks rather than normal expressions of self-respect. Because their self-worth is closely tied to their ability to influence others, losing that influence feels deeply threatening. This is why many people notice that a narcissist becomes increasingly desperate after periods of no contact or emotional distance. They may suddenly reappear after weeks or months of silence, acting as though nothing happened. They may promise change, express regret, or attempt to remind the other person of positive memories. If those efforts fail, they may quickly switch to criticism, blame, or attempts to damage the other person's confidence. The rapid shift between affection and hostility reflects the emotional instability created by losing control, not necessarily genuine emotional intimacy. It is important to understand that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, trust, and freedom. Neither person needs to dominate the other in order to feel secure. A narcissist, however, often experiences relationships very differently. They may view people less as equal partners and more as sources of validation, attention, or emotional regulation. When those sources become unavailable, they are forced to confront uncomfortable feelings they have spent years avoiding. Losing control also removes an important distraction. As long as the narcissist is focused on managing other people's reactions, they can avoid confronting their own fears and insecurities. When that external focus disappears, unresolved emotions become much harder to escape. Feelings of inadequacy, shame, loneliness, or failure may begin to surface, creating significant emotional distress. For the person establishing boundaries, this period can be confusing because the narcissist's reactions may seem unpredictable or even sincere. There may be moments of apparent vulnerability mixed with episodes of anger or manipulation. Understanding what is happening beneath the surface helps explain these shifts. The narcissist is not simply reacting to the loss of a relationship. They are reacting to the loss of influence, certainty, and the emotional structure they depended upon to maintain their sense of self. That loss can create one of the most powerful emotional disruptions they experience, revealing just how dependent they were on controlling the people around them rather than developing genuine emotional security within themselves. Being exposed is one of the most emotionally painful experiences for a narcissist because their identity often depends on maintaining a carefully crafted image. Many narcissists invest enormous energy into appearing successful, intelligent, generous, charming, or morally superior. This public persona becomes their emotional armor. It protects them from feelings of shame and insecurity while attracting admiration and validation from others. When that image begins to fall apart, they may experience an intense emotional reaction that feels overwhelming, even if they rarely admit it. For many narcissists, appearance is everything. They are often less concerned with who they truly are than with how they are perceived. They may work tirelessly to create an impression that others admire, whether through achievements, social status, wealth, attractiveness, or charisma. The admiration they receive becomes a source of emotional stability. It reassures them that the image they have created is working. As long as people continue believing that version of them, they feel relatively secure. The problem arises when someone begins to see behind the mask. This might happen when a close friend notices repeated manipulation, a partner recognizes patterns of emotional abuse, or coworkers begin questioning inconsistent behavior. Suddenly, the carefully managed narrative starts to weaken. Instead of being viewed as flawless or exceptional, the narcissist risks being seen as imperfect, controlling, dishonest, or emotionally immature. This kind of exposure creates a deep emotional wound because it threatens the very foundation of their self-image. Rather than accepting responsibility and reflecting on their behavior, many narcissists experience intense shame that quickly transforms into anger or defensiveness. Shame is an emotion they struggle to tolerate. So instead of processing it internally, they often direct their emotional discomfort toward others. That is why exposure frequently triggers behaviors such as denial, blame shifting, or character attacks. They may insist that everyone else is lying, exaggerating, or trying to destroy their reputation. They might accuse the person speaking the truth of being jealous, unstable, vindictive, or mentally unhealthy. By discrediting the messenger, they attempt to protect the image they value so deeply. In some situations, the narcissist may launch what is commonly known as a smear campaign. They may contact friends, family members, or coworkers to spread misleading stories before the truth becomes widely known. Their goal is often to regain control of the narrative by ensuring that people continue seeing them as the victim rather than the person responsible for harmful behavior. This is less about revenge and more about preserving an identity they fear losing. What makes this especially difficult is that narcissists often believe their own version of events. Their need to protect themselves from painful emotions can become so strong that they genuinely convince themselves they have done nothing wrong. This makes meaningful accountability extremely challenging because admitting fault would require confronting feelings they have spent years avoiding. Exposure can also create anxiety about losing important sources of admiration. If family members, friends, colleagues, or community members begin seeing the narcissist differently, they may fear losing respect, influence, opportunities, or social status. Since external validation plays such a significant role in regulating their emotions, losing it can leave them feeling emotionally unsteady and desperate to repair their public image. This explains why some narcissists react far more strongly to public criticism than to private conversations. A private disagreement may feel uncomfortable, but public exposure threatens the audience they depend upon for validation. The larger the audience, the greater the emotional threat becomes. Even small criticisms shared in front of others may trigger an explosive response because they challenge the image the narcissist has worked so hard to maintain. Ironically, genuine accountability could provide an opportunity for growth. Accepting mistakes, apologizing sincerely, and learning from difficult experiences are signs of emotional maturity. However, because narcissists often equate imperfection with worthlessness, they may view accountability as something dangerous rather than healing. Instead of seeing mistakes as opportunities to improve, they experience them as evidence that they are fundamentally flawed, which is a reality they desperately try to avoid. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why exposure often produces reactions that seem disproportionate. What appears to others as a simple conversation about facts may feel to the narcissist like the collapse of the identity they have spent years constructing. Their emotional breakdown is not necessarily caused by the truth itself, but by the fear that the carefully built image protecting their fragile self-worth can no longer be sustained. For many narcissists, admiration is not simply something they enjoy. It is something they depend on to maintain their emotional stability. While most emotionally healthy people appreciate compliments but do not rely on them for their sense of worth, narcissists often build their identity around external validation. Praise, attention, recognition, and approval become the fuel that keeps their carefully constructed self-image alive. When that source of admiration begins to disappear, they can experience intense emotional distress that feels deeply unsettling. This is one of the reasons why losing validation can cause a narcissist to break down emotionally. A narcissist often seeks constant reassurance that they are important, exceptional, attractive, intelligent, or successful. This reassurance may come from romantic partners, family members, coworkers, friends, or even social media followers. Every compliment reinforces the image they want to believe about themselves. Every expression of admiration temporarily quiets the insecurities they work so hard to hide. Because these feelings of confidence depend on other people, they are never truly secure. They require continuous reinforcement. At first, this need for validation may not seem unusual. Everyone enjoys feeling appreciated. The difference is in the intensity of the dependence. A narcissist may become uncomfortable if attention shifts to someone else, if they are not praised for their efforts, or if they feel ignored. Situations that most people would consider ordinary, such as another coworker receiving recognition or a partner becoming busy with personal responsibilities, can trigger feelings of rejection and emotional instability. When admiration decreases, narcissists often begin searching for explanations that protect their self-image. Instead of considering that attention naturally changes over time, they may believe others are jealous, disrespectful, or intentionally trying to hurt them. This mindset allows them to avoid confronting the painful possibility that they are not receiving the constant validation they expect. Unfortunately, this also creates conflict because they may respond with anger, criticism, or emotional manipulation rather than honest communication. Romantic relationships often reveal this pattern very clearly. During the early stages of a relationship, admiration, both people express affection, excitement, and appreciation. For a narcissist, this phase can feel incredibly rewarding because they receive a steady stream of validation. However, as the relationship becomes more realistic and everyday life takes over, constant praise naturally decreases. Healthy relationships eventually include disagreements, routines, and shared responsibilities. For many narcissists, this normal progression feels like emotional abandonment rather than a natural change. As a result, they may begin demanding more attention, creating unnecessary conflict, or criticizing their partner. Sometimes they seek admiration outside the relationship through flirting, emotional affairs, excessive social media activity, or surrounding themselves with people who constantly praise them. These behaviors are often attempts to replace the validation they believe they have lost rather than genuine solutions to relationship problems. Social media has made this dynamic even more visible. Platforms built around likes, comments, shares, and followers provide immediate forms of external validation. For someone with narcissistic traits, these numbers can become emotionally significant. A post receiving less attention than expected may lead to disappointment, irritability, or anxiety. On the other hand, a highly successful post may temporarily restore feelings of confidence and superiority. This creates a cycle where emotional well-being becomes tied to unpredictable reactions from other people.